image there from 1001 Nights. Next slide. Something else that they introduced to the Western world. Does anybody have any idea what that is? Not you. You can't answer this question. Any guesses? Okay, what? Exactly. It's pasta. Now, you're going to say to yourself, okay, I'm getting up, I'm leaving, because I know this guy's off his rocker. They didn't introduce pasta to us. We know that it was the Chinese. We know it was the Italians. Well, let me qualify this, okay? It was the Muslims who introduced dried pasta. Actually, the Italians, the Romans were cooking with fresh pasta, if you will. You know, they used to make these big, flat, broad noodles that they would put stuff on, put it in the ovens and call it lagana, which is where you get the word lasagna. Certainly the Chinese were using fresh noodles, but it was the Muslims who took these noodles, dried them out. Why would they dry them? Because they traveled through desert country, and they needed to keep this stuff on long journeys. And then what they would do, of course, is toss it into a pot of, actually it wasn't boiling water, they tossed it into a pot of boiling camel's milk, because water was very scarce in the desert. Next slide, please. Ceramics, of course, again, the Chinese were masters of ceramics, but the Muslims also had very thriving ceramic centers in Spain and in Baghdad. Next slide. Carpets, of course, from Turkey and Iran. Next slide. And ceramics, not ceramics, excuse me, crystal, which was an Arabic invention. The great center of that in Spain. Next slide. Now, when you went out shopping, all of this was governed by, next slide, by these guys called the Mutasib, which were, they were sort of like government workers, religious government workers. They were people who went around and made sure that you weren't getting ripped off by the merchant. So they carried around these scales, and they made sure that the merchant scales were weighed out correctly. Next slide. And they are still using scales like that today in the Muslim world. Next slide. But of all the products that the Arabs introduced to Western civilization, the most significant was paper. Again, Chinese invention, but between the 8th and, really around the 8th century, they introduced it to the West, and via Spain and Sicily. Before paper in the West, you had two choices. You had papyrus, which came from Egypt. It could only come from Egypt because the papyrus plant grows in Egypt. Or you could use parchment, which is really an animal skin. You just rub until it's very shiny and red. Very labor intensive. Pain in the neck to make. Paper was cheap to make. You could erase it, which meant you could use it over again. Next slide, please. And it also served a literate society at a time when Charlemagne here, our friend, the king of the Franks, next slide, could barely write his own name. This is his signature. And actually, he had a scribe do most of his form. He managed to do a little diamond in the middle, which spells K-A-R-L-U-S, Carlos. Now, granted, to give the old boy some credit, he did inspire something called the Carolingian Renaissance, where he brought a lot of great minds to come and introduce ideas, but a lot of those great minds got their ideas from Arabic schools. Next slide. So they were great readers. Next slide. And you had to have a highly literate society in a society where the Quran needed to be read and memorized. Next slide. I'm going to take you on a quick little journey here. Anybody here been to Venice? Okay. Buckle your seatbelts in your gondolas. We're going to go to Venice just briefly here. Next slide. Venice, this is Venice. Now, it looks, if you take a look at this architecture, it looks kind of vaguely Oriental, doesn't it? Vaguely, Arabic. Next slide.